according to the cloud. Okay. I'm not ready to leave Tisha B'Av behind this week because Moses isn't in the Torah portion. He's continuing, basically, if you'll notice, he's really not introducing a lot of new statutes, commandments, things like that. He does add 3 cities of refuge in this Torah portion. And we're going to look at specifically those 3 cities of refuge and what they might mean and how all this might actually be tying together in a sense with the point that Moses is trying to make, because otherwise it's just randomly thrown in there and it looks really out of context until you try to figure out, okay, let's go back and look up the names of the cities of refuge and where they were located. And maybe that's Moses is actually sending a subliminal message or definitely an embedded message within the text. But still, if you've read the portion already, you've noticed Moses just can't seem to quit blaming the Israelites because he can't go into the land. And I'm laughing, but it's not like a happy laugh. I'm so sorry, Moses. He invested 40 years of his life with complaining, never happy, rarely generous, all the things we probably say about each other sometimes. He spent 40 years of his life with those people, and there is a limit, if you're human, to how much of that you can deal with. And here at the end, he's like, please, 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 and the answer is still no, Moses. You can't do this. I'm gonna teach something by holding you back from crossing the Jordan. But you can tell it's still on his mind, because he'll say, because of you, I can't go into the land, because of you. He was angry with me because of you. And so I don't think he was just venting. I think in each of these cases where he's trying to point out maybe it just wasn't one event that kept him out of the land. Some of the sages trace it all the way back to when he argued about going and he slandered Israel before he ever went to Egypt. From Midian. And so it was more of a kind of a accumulation of problems, not simply the one problem of striking the rock, which absolutely was part of it. But Moses cannot leave Tisha B'Av behind, because this is one of the things he points to. He says, because of this. It's because of these 10 spies, explorers, reporters that I sent out. Because of what they caused with this bad report, because they put themselves and their ability ahead of the ark and ahead of the pillar of cloud, now I can't go in. And so, again, we know this occurs on Tisha B'Av, and lots of things occur on Tisha B'Av that are disastrous. And this year, I thought it, again, not fun, but I think it would be interesting to pull in a current event, because sometimes we can look at Tisha B'Av and say, well, nothing really happened, It's kind of like the feast days sometimes, because we're conditioned to study some of the apocalyptic things that might fall on a certain day, like Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. When we go through the day and it seems pretty peaceful, we're thinking, well, it was a nice holiday, but where's the end of the world, And the end of the world hasn't come yet. But I think he still sends us little messages to encourage us in between the end of the world, as we know it, to say, you know what, I'm still here. And for those who know what they're looking for, remember there was it Issachar? It said they knew the times. They knew how to discern the times. And so they knew when things fell on certain times, what that was all about. And so we went through, Shabbat was actually Tisha B'Av, and then we had yesterday. And so this morning, I sat down to study, and I thought, well, nothing really amazing happened on Tisha B'Av that would mark it as a horrible day or a disastrous day or anything like that. And then as I started studying the Torah portion and seeing some of the problems in this recounting, part of the story of Moses recounting the story of Tisha B'Av, what I realized is something did happen on Tisha B'Av this year. And because I'm not much of a news hound, it really went right over my head. Then I had to go back and read a bunch of articles to figure out what was going on. Because I think we're so conditioned to hearing about scandals, sex scandals, that now we just don't pay any attention to them anymore. They just kind of like roll off our backs like everything else, mass shootings and those sorts of things. We know they're bad, but that we've become desensitized to them. And so with this, I was like, wow, something actually did happen that did concern Tisha B'Av, if you know what you're looking for. And there's 3 things that we're looking for in Tisha B'Av. And before I get into those 3 things, we have a guest speaker tonight. We have Keisha Gallagher. And the reason I wanted her to come on tonight and talk to us for a while is because she's done research into sex trafficking. And that's important as it concerns this Torah portion. So right now, you're sitting there like, oh, I know what happened on Tisha B'Av. Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. And that's the part that kind of went over my head because all I knew was sex scandal. I did not know how deep and how wide the scandal was, and the fact that it involved very young girls, and that even Israeli government officials, their names are popping up in this. So I went to an Israeli news source, and sure enough, there's a picture of Ehud Barak going into Jeffrey Epstein's house and saying, oh yes, I went to Sex Island, but nothing happened. Now you believe that when you hear a politician say it. I didn't inhale. I didn't touch that woman. So it might be true. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt, but they definitely gave the appearance of evil when I started going through these articles. And then I went back a year on Tisha B'Av. I was like, is there a pattern here of some sort? And so it had a list of significant events for each day of 2018. So I pulled up Tisha B'Av, and apparently that was when, which Jeffrey Epstein is Jewish, when Michael Cohen, who is also Jewish, secretly recorded Donald Trump instructing him to pay off the Playboy mistress or whatever she was, prostitute. I'm not sure. I didn't read it closely. I just looked at the headline. I thought, there seems to be a pattern here of prominent people involved in illicit sexual behavior. And sexual immorality is going to be one of the 3 things we're going to look at in the context of Tisha B'Av. And so lest we think that these things that we're reading about in the Torah belong 3,000 years ago, they don't. Because we can read in the book of Revelation where it talks about human trafficking. You know, of all the cargoes that are listed as they're bemoaning Babylon, the great is fallen, the last cargo there is human cargo. Human souls is what it says. And so human souls are still being bought and sold. So because Keisha's got some good research for us, and can give us the context for some of this, I think then it will help set the stage where we can kind of slide into these 3 things out of the Torah portion, the sin of the spies, Tisha B'Av, and so forth. So let me see what I need to do to share the mic here. I'm going to put, how about, I think what I'll do is I'll just unmute you and then I'll mute myself, and that'll prevent any. Okay, can you?
Yeah, can you guys hear me? I've got on a headset too. Thought it might be more clear. Good. Well, hi everyone. I'm not in these live classes, but I listen to these messages every week because I learn a lot and they encourage me a whole lot. But I am not an expert in sex trafficking, but I have done a lot of research, and that came about with me just really studying about women, their biblical role, but just the plot of women since the beginning. And you cannot look into women without seeing this huge factor of sex trafficking, which, you know, I knew it existed. I've watched that movie. I can't think of the guy's name, Taken, where his daughter's taken, and, you know, they immediately put her into trafficking, and they, you know, immediately also addict her to drugs, which is very, very common in that sex trafficking world. But I didn't realize it's really in every one of our backyards. And that's what I think just shook me to my core, thinking you can see how it would happen in poor nations, perhaps, because really, truly, it is the poor and the marginalized groups that are affected mostly by trafficking. And it's not just women. Men are involved in this, and so are children. But you can just pull up some internet websites, and I'm going to give you some here at the end that you can look at, because I'm reading from one of those now. It's from a website called Free the Slaves, and it just has statistics. It's estimated, and the reason why it's an estimation is because there are so many people that are in some sort of forced labor, whether it is sexual or not. It's hidden under the ground. But what we can see, there is around 21 to 40 million people. That's the size of a country that are in slavery right now as I speak. And I've got to get this hair out of my face. It's driving me crazy. Give me a second. Okay. 50% of those victims, it's labor. So this is not just sex. This is the food we eat, which is often sexual immorality. And the foods we eat are put together in the Bible, you know, food sacrificed to idols. And in this case, it would be an idol unto greed and money. So I'm going to give you some resources for that as well to look, because sometimes what you're picking up at the grocery store has come from trafficking, labor trafficking. So 50% of those 40 million are in labor. 37.5 are in forced marriages. 12.5% of those are in sexual slavery. And out of all of those together, there's 71% of them are women and girls. That's a huge, huge number. And you've got about 29% that it would be men and boys. And 25% of that whole total are people under 18, which is our children. This is our future. So that sort of amazes me. And that's from Free the Slaves. I'm going to make sure you get a link so that you can just pull up those facts. But when we think about slavery, and we hear this all the time, right now, especially since it's a hot button in our country about racism and the African-American slaves that were brought over here, but I'm going to give you some context for that. There were 12.5 million Africans that were enslaved and taken to America in the transatlantic slave trade. And that was from the years 1525 to 1866. And so relatively, the population, of course, was smaller there altogether, but that means that there are far more people in slavery in our day and age than there was back then. And most of them are women and children. And we see activists today that are doing a lot of work. You do see a lot of actors like Ashton Kutcher, I think is his name, that are really involved in trying to help make people aware. And many of you, I think, probably are more aware of sex trafficking today than even when I started looking into this. And that was probably just 6 or 7 years ago. And I got my hands on a book called Half the Sky. And that is by Nicholas Kristof, and I can't remember the woman's name. I think her last name is Wu. But that book is a secular book, and they were journalists, and they were traveling over to a bunch of different countries, and they just started seeing this plight everywhere they went, particularly with women and children. And that's why it's called Half the Sky, because half our population is women. And so they just had a burden on their heart to start making people aware and to start getting involved at governmental levels and just with local charity organizations for awareness, and so that they could start setting up sting operations all over the world, not just in America, to start setting some of these women free. And so the more I looked into this, just the sicker I got, because as Halisa says, this goes back to ancient times. This is the whole Babylonian system that spirit is still very much alive today, is what is behind that. It's that fallen nature. It's all those desires, just lust, just completely ruling and mastering these people, and they become particularly vicious. And although you would think that it is mostly men like Jeffrey Epstein that is behind all this with lots of money, it's not. Or maybe you think on these smaller scales, it's just the pimps and those sorts of things that are in charge, and it's men, and they just have this power, physical power over women. While that's true, there are numerous women involved. Women are often involved in luring them in, making them feel safe and protected, because you're talking about, especially in America, for example, it's runaways. They've got problems at home. Maybe there's abuse at home. Maybe there's just alcohol abuse or drug abuse. There's something that's making these girls and boys want to go to the streets, or they can come from a perfectly normal family. They can come from a Torah pursuant family like we have in our community. And these kids are on the internet, and they're getting on websites and chat rooms, and they're looking for attention. And these people are posing, and it can be men or women, posing as friends and as much younger people, and are trying to get them to come out and meet them. You know, we see missing kid reports and things of that nature come up all the time. And a lot of those have been brought into trafficking, and they'll immediately terrify them to keep them from trying to run by telling them that they are going to kill their family. If you tell anybody, if you tell the police, if you try to run, we know where, you know, they find out their address. They could even find family member names and all of these things, trying to terrify them to stay where they are. And then, of course, often they addict them to drugs, or they'll keep them in a place where they are tied up, literally naked. And by the way, I didn't say this. If you guys have kids listening, this would not be the one that they want to listen to. But I do recommend that if you have teenagers and you should have by now had those sex talks with them, they need to be aware of this. Not just your girls, but your boys. Because a lot of these kids and young women and boys that are brought in by these traffickers, it's not just that they're prostituting them out to make a buck. They are also filming them. And so a great deal of the pornography that is found on the internet, it's these children, which is just sickening and horrifying. But, you know, I don't have daughters, but I do have sons, and I made them very aware, because I know that I can't always control every little thing that they're doing. And they're both over 18 now anyway on the internet. But I tell them, if something like that were to pop up in those ads and you click on them, and I don't care if that girl is smiling or not, the odds are that she is a slave, that someone is controlling her completely. They will beat her if she does not perform these acts. And so you watching it or paying for it in any form or fashion, you know, you are promoting, you know, this person being in slavery. So, and I went way further than I wanted to on some of this stuff, but I want to give you some more statistics. The United States is the biggest buyer of sex trafficking and prostitution. Although there are U.S. Citizens, children that are taken into that system, we bring them in from other countries, from Asia, from Africa, from Brazil. I mean, there's just different places that we will even ship them in. And so if we are supposed to be a Judeo-Christian nation living by biblical values, which I know we're getting away from that, but I know that there's many of us that still strive for that, then we need to ask ourselves why. Why would we be the biggest buyers of something like this? Because if there wasn't a demand, then there wouldn't be a need for the supply. And so even our big entertainment things like the Super Bowl, that is one of the times in the year where girls are shipped in on tractor trailers. And, you know, once I started learning that they're often shipped that way, and you're driving on the interstate and you see all these trucks, and it gives you an opportunity to pray if there were to be human souls that are enslaved, that are being moved in these vehicles, just to pray for them. But I think the Super Bowl itself sort of is one of those, and I'm not against football, I'm not saying that, but, or games in particular, but we in America, those things they rule a lot of people's lives. Sports can be just as much of addiction to some people as a drug. And you guys know that. So they're brought in from the Philippines, Thailand, Honduras, Guatemala, India, El Salvador. And about 100,000 to 300, because we don't know the exact number of those, are actually just taken right from the U.S. And so when we are thinking about our job, what can we do to help this situation? And that's one of the things that I really want to promote tonight is, what can you do? There are local chapters in nearly every city, if not, they're definitely in your state, that are organized to educate people about trafficking, to fundraise, to help the girls when they get out. Because when they get out of this, can you imagine how demented your mind would be after being in situations like that, after being exploited and used as if you were, you know, a piece of property, worse than a beast or an animal. So you can think about the psychological things that they need to go through. You can think about their physical needs. They need education. They need clothes. They need a place to stay. Many of them end up pregnant, and then you therefore then have a child that is in the mix that needs to be taken care of. And so in my state, there is an End the Slavery chapters in my city as well that you can participate in. But if you can't participate, you can donate. And that's one of the things that I do a lot, because these feet and hands on the ground, I don't have time to do a lot of that, but I can donate money. And that's something that you can do as well. You can learn the signs, and I'm going to give you some of those because I happen to be a manicurist, and I know that there's a lot of little manicure shops, you know, it seems to be on every corner. And some of those, and massage parlors, I know you've seen them in the news, and things of that nature are really fronts for sex trafficking or even forced labor. So if you come across someone or a group, or you could even be shopping somewhere, you can be in a store, because, you know, they do take them into public places at times, but they're usually very quiet. They're very meek. You can tell that they are under the authority of this man or even a woman that they are with. If you go into a place of business, you can tell that all these people sort of live together in one place. These are just red flags. It doesn't mean something's necessarily going on. You can tell that they are not supposed to speak to you or speak to a stranger or speak to the store clerks. That you can tell that there's sort of not a natural just conversation like a normal family would have. You can see signs maybe of physical abuse. You can see that they're very submissive and fearful. You can see that they are often under 18 and probably don't look like their captor. They don't favor them. You can tell that they're not family. But if you were to be in front of one of them, for example, let's say you went and got your nails done at one of these places. And I am from the Nashville area. I don't live there now, but I remember specifically, and I knew where this salon was located, and this happened maybe 4 years ago. I don't remember even the name of it. But I knew people that said they had gotten their nails done at this particular salon, and it was busted. It was busted for trafficking. But if you can talk to them and they can speak English, you can ask them, you know, can you leave your job if you want to? There's certain questions you can sort of start prodding them for information. Can you come and go as you please? Have you been hurt or threatened? And have you tried to leave? Has your family been threatened? You can ask questions like this. But of course, you wouldn't take matters into your own hands. There are hotlines you could call 911, obviously, but there is a trafficking hotline that you can call. It's 1-888-37-888. If you just suspect, and they will investigate. And hopefully you're wrong, but it's better to be safe than sorry, because you can save many, many lives. Because if they are in sex trafficking, the average lifespan of those girls and young men, once they are in it, is only 7 years. They are just used and then put out with the trash. I mean, and that's tragic, but it is true, and you can save their lives. But I think the biggest thing that you and I can do first is get educated and tell other people, and tell your children, teach them signs to look for, especially on the internet. If they're communicating, they need to be fully aware that people lie, that people pose, that there are real predators out there. The book I mentioned was Half the Sky, and there's a documentary on there on Amazon, actually. It's PBS publishes it, also called Half the Sky. But it looks like more recently they've done a series. They joined with PBS, and they did 3 episodes, but they're long. They're a little over an hour each. And I encourage you, as hard as it is to watch what happens and to see them go in and to see the faces, I encourage you to see the faces, to take a day and just say, I am going to put faces to these possible 40 million people, because I think that is what really changed my perspective more than anything. I read the book, I can hear the statistics, I can give money and help, but to actually see those faces, to see those girls and young men and women that are trafficked, I don't know, it does something to your heart. And I think it goes to the heart of the gospel message. It goes back to Isaiah 61. And that's what Messiah actually got up and read in the synagogue when he said that he had came to set the captives free. If that was his goal and mission, then I think that is our goal and mission, because it is the antithesis to the Babylonian system, where everything is just goods and merchandise and about the dollar. I actually have a menu heading on my website, graceandtorah.net, and it's just called trafficking. And if you click on that, I have a whole list of links of some of them are ministries, some of them are secular, but one of them is Half the Sky Movement that is based on the book and documentary I just mentioned. One of them is called Not for Sale. One is called Free the Slaves. One is called Hope for Justice. And there is a link also on there called Responsible Sourcing Tool. And what that is because we all exchange goods. I mean, you can't avoid it. We have to buy and sell in order to eat, in order to live. But you can go here and you can find out, like your particular grocery chain, you can find out where the source comes from. Does this go back to forced labor? So this isn't about sex trafficking, but it is about forced labor. And you can see where you got those strawberries, where they're sourcing their goods. And I think that's important too, because it's one of the ways, if we don't buy from those places and tell our grocer, look, this place that you're sourcing this from, goes back to forced labor over in India or wherever it might be, and I'm not going to buy it anymore. Well, then that will force them to get them from a better source. And so I'm curious to see how Lisa is going to tie this all into the Torah portion.
Tisha, could I ask you to repeat that hotline number again, please?
Yes, it's 1-888-373-7888. And worst case scenario, if you didn't have that on hand, if you were suspecting, you can call 911, which they would probably just give you the number, but you can do that. Does anybody else have any questions or want me to clarify something? I'll send Halisa a couple links and she can include them in the recording email. How's that sound?
That would be great. That would be great. Nobody has any more questions? Because it's a problem. And what I want to do is I want to trace it, not just accept what's in the Torah portion here, but take some clues. Because Moses is dropping tons of clues. He started last week dropping clues. And then in this week's Torah portion, he's going to drop clues. And one of those clues is going to be the word peor. It's a location. But if you'll remember, there was also the sin with Baal Peor, which was a sexual sin. And if you'll remember, I think it was last year, it wasn't this year, but the year before that, when I taught that Torah portion, we spent a little time talking about Cosby, who was caught, well, she wasn't caught, I mean, they were pretty blatant, there with Zimri. And she was actually the daughter of a prince, of a king. And when a king will prostitute his daughter out of territorial concerns, when it becomes part of the idolatry, just like with Molech, they started sacrificing their children and somehow entwining sacrificing their children up in their worship, their spiritual activity. And so the same thing we saw with Baal Peor. You're mixing up sexual activity, but one of the greatest lessons that we miss in that story, because we focus more on the zeal of Pinchas, he's not going to put up with it. He just drives the spirit through him. That's going to be the end of that. But we completely miss how that daughter was prostituted. And by whom? By a prominent person, by the king of Midian, basically. And as Moses is recounting in this Torah portion, again, going back to Tisha B'Av and the 10 spies, we said last week maybe explorer was a better word for it. It's at a different point, because remember, it's tour, like somebody who walks around and looks. They explore, and it's only later in a different context that they're called spies. But their job wasn't to come back and tell Moses whether they could or couldn't. Their job was to come back and give a report. And this week I want to show you, I think, what Moses wanted them to experience when he sent them out for 40 days. Because if you'll remember, Moses also spent 40 days having an experience. I think that he thought those spies would have the same sort of spiritual experience that he did. And obviously only 2 of them out of the 12 did. But he keeps bringing up Peor. He'll mention it 3 times, and we'll go through those scriptures. I've got them on the PowerPoint for you. Peor, Peor, Peor. 3 different contexts in the same Torah portion. So when we see that, we have to pay attention. He keeps bringing up Peor, which is going to be Beit Peor, which is going to be like the house of Peor, but we know it's going to be associated with Baal Peor, which is an idolatry that involves not just sexual activity, but in the specific case that we have, prostituting your own daughter. And we know there's a specific commandment in the Torah that you shall not prostitute your daughter. I mean, no, an Israelite does not do these things. And so Moses is bringing this up. Now, I'm going to give you the very end of where we're going. And it'll take a long time to get there, but I'm just going to give you the end, even if I don't get to the end until tomorrow. There's a strange statement. Let me find it. It's going to be in Bereshit 6. You say, what does Bereshit 6 have to do with Moses taking the parting shots at Israel? Might have a lot to do with it. We might have a paleo prophecy that's going to eventually explain these three things that we can associate with Tisha B'Av and the destruction of the temple, actually the destruction of a people who should be called apart. And the reason I brought up Jeffrey Epstein, and then the Tisha B'Av the year before, Michael Cohen, both being Jewish, the reason to use them as an example is because as Jews, they should have known better than to be conducting sex trafficking. If you've read the Torah once, it should have been more than adequate. I'm guessing as these men grew up, at least until bar mitzvah age, a lot of them quit going to synagogue if they're more secular after their bar mitzvah. But growing up, at least, every year they're cycling not just through this Torah portion, not just through the commandments that tell them, you can't be sex trafficking, especially your own kinfolk. They should have known better. And Moses believes that these spies, I believe, that they're going to have this same spiritual experience that he did when he received the tablets in the 40 days. But obviously, the Israelites, he goes down, what does he see? He sees the golden calf, and it says they rose up to play, which tells us they were engaging in sexual activity. Now, the commentary also tells us that the women were not engaging in this, that somehow they did not participate, nor would they have participated in the sin of Baal Peor. So in two instances, traditionally, the women were not engaging in the sexual immorality, the biggies that Moses is mentioning in this Torah portion. But those two men should have known better. If we go back a year or so, there's I can't remember his first name, but he's part of the Kraft food empire. He owns, what is it, the Patriots? He owns a professional football team, and he got busted, I believe, at one of these kinds of massage places you're talking about. And they got him dead to rights too, with women who had been trafficked. And there was no denying it was on camera. And so again, using Jews as an example, but they're examples of who we are too. Because if they know the Torah, then they know better than to either be a purchaser or a prostitutor, the pimp, the one who, remember how many weeks ago was it how we talked about how much worse it was to set the trap than to be the one caught in the trap? That the one who actually does the thinking is the one in Scripture who's treated as a much more wicked person than just your average everyday sinner. If you understand exactly what you're doing and you're setting up the trap, then it's treated as a greater sin. We say, well, sin. Not necessarily in the Torah. There's certain things that you got different punishments for it. And it doesn't, especially read the Psalms, it does not have nice things to say about the person that sets the trap. And I didn't ask Keisha exactly what she was going to say, but she said what I have on one of these PowerPoint slides: how do you trap somebody? Attention, attention, attention is what I wrote. When you give people attention and when you give them what they want, that's how you snare them. And yes, children are susceptible. But you know what? As grown-ups, we can be like Michael Cohen, like Jeffrey Epstein, like this Kraft guy. We can know it's wrong and still be trapped by what I want. Attention, attention, attention. And so if we look at, say, Baal Peor, we see a better example of that maybe than what we see with the golden calf. I don't know, maybe boredom factored into that one, but especially with Baal Peor, what did the men get? First of all, they got attention. Why? Because these Moabite and Midianite women who were being trafficked had been trained how to give them attention, attention, attention. And it feels good. And you want to believe you're handsome, or you want to believe you're pretty. And so the compliments, of course. And then from there, it's a very short jump. Well, let's just have a meal. It's not like, worshiping our God if we just sit down and have a meal, right? It's just, come on. It's just trick or treat candy. It's not going to send you to hell, right? And then it's little bit at a time. You're getting the attention, you're getting the candy, right? And before you know it, well, it's just no big thing. I mean, just do this one thing, and it's, we know that you've got your own God and everything, but we'll have so much more fun. And you'll get so much more attention if you'll compromise on this little thing right there. And by that time, they were in the trap. But they knew better. They're like these people in the news that keep getting caught on Tisha B'Av. And that's why Moses is going over this. You should have known better. But I'm going to tell you again. I'm going to tell you again. Just like Mom, I'm going to tell you again. And I don't think you can go over this too much with your children and your grandchildren or yourself. Right? Don't ever think you're past being tempted and lured in. Because the enemy knows just exactly what kind of fruit you want to eat in the garden. That's how far back it goes. He knows your taste buds. But what I want to show you in Bereshit, it's Genesis 6. Here it is. And there's so many translations of this when it comes to the B'nai Elohim. You guys know what I'm talking about when I say the B'nai Elohim? Yes, no, maybe. There's a debate as to whether the giants were giants or just important people. And I'm not really in the debate. I'm going to kind of assume it was giants, but I'm okay if they were just important people either. They don't have to be giants for me. But in chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass when man began to increase upon the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of the judges," here they're translating B'nai Elohim as sons of the judges instead of the sons of God. All right. And another one that I read today, it said the sons of prominent men. Right? Because Elohim can mean judges or prominent people. So when the text is ambiguous, it does typically generate controversy. But whoever they are, it says the sons of the judges saw the daughters of man when they were good. Some translations will see that they were good, or that they were fair, or that they were beautiful. And they took themselves wives from whomever they chose. All right, that word right there doesn't always mean wife. It can just mean women, females, nashim. They took females from whomever they chose. And Hashem said, "My spirit shall not contend evermore concerning man because he is flesh. Besides, his days shall be 120 years." Who lived to be 120? How about Moses? So you think there might be a connection between this passage and Moses repeating this information about Peor, 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 which we know has to do with sexual immorality that eventually turned into idolatry, and then it turned into bloodshed. People had to die at the end of that, and that's the way it usually works out. But when we unpack this, and like I said, I don't know if we'll do it tonight or tomorrow, I'm going to go back to this passage and show you the chiastic structure of it. Because right in the middle, that's how I found that. Because the reason I found it, because Moses keeps going back to these things in history. And we realize that something happened with that first set of tablets. The second set of tablets was different because Moses wrote them through divine inspiration, and it was just rock. It was just plain old stone. The understanding is that the first set of tablets was on sapphire, and it was written by the finger of God. And thus, it was filled, according to the tradition, with the Spirit of God. That the Shekhinah actually resided in the words on those tablets after Moses spent 40 days on the mountain. And that phrase is going to pop up in the Torah portion too, about the mountain, as it goes back to the sin of the spies. And so when Moses sees them committing sexual immorality and idolatry around the golden calf, what does he do? He does throw them down, but the tradition is that the reason he throws them down is because the Shekhinah fled. It ran away. It went back to its source. It says the letters just came off of the tablets and they went back to their source because the divine presence inhabited those words. And so later, when Moses has to do it himself, he realizes that he's writing the Torah on hearts of stone. That those people down there, they did not receive the spiritual word of the Torah. Because the spiritual word of the Torah, and we'll look at a play on word, actually, in the text, where when they were engraved on the sapphire tablets, you could pronounce it two different ways. One is saying it was engraved, and the other translation would say freedom. That the original tablets were written with freedom. And they didn't know, the people didn't know how to be free. They didn't know how not to be slaves. And therefore, they didn't know how not to enslave others. And so part of this process is, if you have righteous women, of course, they're not going to fall for it. Like with the golden calf or the sin of Baal Peor, they're not going to fall for it. In fact, the rabbis say, had they sent women to report on the land, they would have never brought back a bad report. Because there's just certain things, and they say the women have a strong connection to the land. The men are more task-oriented with them, and that when they brought the report, that's why they were trying to analyze their ability to do it. You talk to any modern male, and he's exactly the same way, right? Women are going to be much more encouraging. You can do it, and the men are like, let's look at the statistics here. Well, the odds are, no, I'm not putting my money on that team, right? And so the men weren't really willing to put their money on the Israelite team against the Canaanites. But the women would have said they're more spiritually oriented. And so if you're going to take a woman captive, you really have to do it before she's spiritually mature. That's why they get them young, before they are formed, because they are much easier to deceive the younger they are. And that's why there's going to be another play on word where it talks about, let's go back to the text. I actually have it on PowerPoint.
Can I something here? Just talking about getting them young, I think about, all the things that young children are exposed to with television and stuff today. And when they're that young, they can't differentiate between fantasy and reality. So those things that are false in that captivity they believe that is reality, that they can't escape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you want to bear that burden? You know, if you're 13 years old and they say they're going to go kill your family, you believe them. And, you know, they might, depending on what country you're in, they could very well do it. They could carry that out. And there might be a reason to believe them. But at that age, you know, especially little girls are still looking for that father figure. You know, and I think more and more little boys are looking for that father figure too, and they're not finding it. It's the absent father that's making a huge impact on the negative statistics. But, you know, it's this shows you when the spirit flees. In America, we have lots of laws, but the spirit has fled. And so what are we starting to see? The same things that Moses is talking about kept them out of the land, kept a generation out of the land. The same things. Why? Because there was no spirit and there was no liberty in their law. They saw it as an enslavement, as a burden to be borne, and it fell on rocky soil. That's when we're going to look at these 3 cities of refuge and see what they mean. Because they tell the whole story. They're like a summary of everything Moses is trying to tell them went wrong. But what could go right in the future? But it's basically that the freedom of the Shekhinah fled away from the law, and therefore that generation could only engage it with rocky hearts. And so we've got a generation where we've pushed the 10 Commandments out. We've definitely pushed the spirit of the 10 Commandments out, and the spirit is fleeing. It sees the sexual, there are 3 things that are going to make the spirit flee. One of them is going to be the sexual immorality, which is really twisted around the idolatry. If you notice, they go together because one is adultery, just like the other one, sexual immorality, but then idolatry is just in a spiritual sense. You're also fornicating or being the prostitute or whatever. It's simply coming out of a different realm, but it's the same thing. Sexual immorality and idolatry will cause the Shekhinah, the presence of Adonai, to flee. And when the presence of Adonai flees, when the spirit flees, it leaves us with nothing but slavery. That's the only way that we can engage that word. So here's Moses carving these words, and he knows this is their hearts. The spirit has been contending with them, and he's quit. He's not going to contend with them. He'll lead them, but he's not going to contend with them. And so we have this nugget, this axis of the chiasm here. In verse 3, Hashem said, my spirit shall not contend evermore concerning man because he is flesh. Besides, his days shall be 120 years. I think there's a message there, and I think it's referring to Moses. Now, I'm also sure that these things run in repeated cycles, so it may not just be Moses, but I think that gives us a hint as to what's going on here with this travelogue that Moses is giving us, because you've got the other side of the chiasm in verse 4. Look how it matches, and I've got it sketched out on PowerPoint. I'll pull it up here in a minute. If you compare, the sons of the judges saw the daughters of man when they were good. They took themselves women, females, from whomever they chose. Hashem said, my spirit shall not contend evermore concerning man because he is flesh. Besides, his days shall be 120 years. Okay, that was one side of the chiasm, and then the axis. Now here's the other side. The Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of the judges would consort with the daughters of man, who would bear to them. They were the mighty, who from old were men of the name. Who did Moses send to explore the land? Men of renown. And so they had the opportunity, like Moses, to spend 40 days. We know from last year's study that the route it took them, it was supernatural. They could not have covered that ground in that number of days. So they were having an elevated spiritual experience to some extent. Just like Moses, he doesn't eat or drink for 40 days. That's not natural. He's in a different realm. So these men of renown, they do have an elevated experience. What's the difference? To Moses, the word was inspired of the Shekhinah, and that's the way that he received it. To the 10, that was not the way they received it. They received it on rock. And therefore, going into the land to them was not freedom. It was an enslavement. They were about to activate all these laws that they'd only been learning up to this point. You know how much of the Torah rests on you being in the land? And so it's been free food, free drink, free clothes up to this point. And now they're going to have to start working. They're going to have to start harvesting. They're going to have to start thinking about tithing. Can you imagine sitting and learning about tithing for 40 years and thinking it was never going to be anything other than a theory that we could debate? Yeah, I know that never happens. But see, I think there's a chiasm right there that really is going to help us. So that's kind of the end point of where we'll be going tomorrow. And let me go ahead and pull that out so you can just freeze on it if you want to, once I send you the recording. And it was such a long chiasm, I didn't think it would work on PowerPoints, so I used colors. And so if you'll match the colors on the PowerPoint, let me just, I'll go forward until I find it here. There you are. And you notice too, we've just thrown Ehud Barak into the mix as being mixed up in all this. So there again, people who should know better getting mixed up with sex traffickers. And Ehud Barak, and I didn't want to repeat anything that didn't seem to have a factual basis to it because nobody's been put on trial yet. But basically, by Ehud Barak's own admission, he went into a business venture with Jeffrey Epstein after Epstein had already been convicted of this on a prior charge, a prior state charge. So he already knew the man was a pervert. And he did it anyway. Like Keisha said, if you know this is coming from a place where people are being abused, then don't buy it. And to me, if you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that this person is a sex pervert, why in the world would you go into business with him? And to some extent, we'd have to come out of the world to completely cut ourselves off from every bad thing that a corporation selling food or cars or other products. I mean, eventually you wouldn't be able to have anything because it's all one big incestuous, unhappy family at the end of the day. But something that blatant, especially looking at those three sins, sexual immorality will make the Shekhinah run away. It will run. Why would you want to strike hands with a person like that that's going to make the Spirit of God run away from you? Wow, right? Okay. Sorry, I got distracted. Where did you go? There you are. Okay. So I gave you the whole passage, Genesis 6, 1 through 4. So if you want to take a gander at it later, I didn't actually work out like with the AA, BB, CC, DD. I didn't do that. I basically just divided it into the two sides of the chiasm. And then I put the axis in there, which was the 120 years. Why? Because the spirit is not going to strive forever. It's going to run away. If there's sexual immorality, if there's idolatry, or if there's bloodshed, those are going to be the three things. And that goes all the way back again to Noah. Those three things will drive the presence of Adonai from your house, from your city, from your state, from your country, faster than anything else. Those three things. And it just seems like as the days pass, we fall deeper and deeper and deeper into sexual immorality, idolatry, and bloodshed. And what is idolatry? It's basically thinking that you can strip the power from the creator of the universe and replace it with your own morality. That was the pitch in the garden. Remember? The snake had a pitch. He had a good pitch. It worked. He was a great marketing agent. And he said, you'll be as gods. So what do? Idolatry is just not bowing down before some silver figure. It's actually elevating yourself so that you can be God. And then it's trying to make God into a human, which is exactly what these gods and goddesses were. They were really just human beings that they gave superpowers like comic books. But they committed adultery, they committed rape, they murdered, they schemed, they robbed, they plundered. Any evil a human being has ever imagined, when you had to study Greek and Roman mythology in school, you found out they did all those things. And they were gods. So what did that do? It says, well, what's a god? He's nothing more than a human being. He's just, a glorified version of myself. But we are as gods. So you have to bring God down a level as if you could. But see, that's the deceit. You think you can. That's what this is. You be as gods. Okay, give me a bite. You better not eat that. Don't eat that. Attention, 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 deception. Do not fall into that. Because what does attention do? It lifts you up so other people will look at you, and that's how you replace God. Now, we all need positive attention. We're human beings. It's part of, with your children, you definitely want them to have the right kind of attention. But we don't want to let them get hooked into activities where people are basically consuming and feeding on their sexuality. With sports stars, I know some. I know a retired NFL player who played with Brett Favre on the Green Bay Packers, and he has an organization for pro football players who don't know what to do with themselves once they get hurt or they retire or they just can't play anymore. They age out, they can't get a contract, and they have no idea what to do with themselves because they've been as gods. Most of them since they were in middle school. They were good, way back. And they got special attention from the teachers. They got special attention from the family. They got special attention from the coaches. They got special attention from the professors. They got special attention from their agents. Remember, show me the money, right? They were as gods. And then they found out they weren't, and they had to mow their own grass. And they didn't know what to do. And so with our kids, if they're in sports, they need to keep that in they need to maintain humility. The language that is used in sports competitions is horrendous. No. There's no humility at all. But there's a lot of things with kids, and I'm not anti-cheerleader, but I'm anti-cheerleader if you don't have all your clothes on. All right, if you're up there doing the splits and basically a bikini, I got issues with that. Because that little girl has no idea what those boys are thinking until it's too late. Because you can't unknow what you know. And they're too young, they're deceived. Because maybe mama wanted the attention. Mama pushed her to go to the dance classes and the cheerleading classes and to try out and bought her hundreds of dollars worth of stuff. And I'm thinking, did you ever ask her if that's what she wanted? Have you had a discussion about uniforms and how much of your body needs to be covered so that I don't feel like I'm prostituting you by putting you out there in front of strange men to do cartwheels and splits when you're not really dressed for that? And it's one thing when it's little girls doing dance with a bunch of other little girls, but when they're 16, 17, and 18, they're not little girls anymore, but they're still thinking like little girls if they're that innocent. Problem is, most of them aren't that innocent. They've seen too much on the internet, on billboards and movies, and probably at school in the hallway, from what I hear. They're just not as innocent as we were. The world has changed, and sometimes that means we got to clamp down a little bit on the boundaries, because our parents could probably trust us to go in more places with our friends than I would want my kids to go today if I didn't know those friends pretty darn well. And it's hard for Hebrew roots kids to find like kind and like mind to hang out with. And even among those kids, you don't know what their experiences are. You can't tell by appearances. But again, you do have to guard your children. It's important. And teach them that attention is not what it appears to be. And tell them that they'll never get over that being bait. No matter how old you get, people like attention. And so it's not just because they're young and you're old, but you're trying to teach them something. Because how many of our heroes of Scripture messed up at the end? Solomon messed up at the end. David messed up at the end. When you think you're too spiritual to mess up, you mess up. And so beware of attention. But anyway, we'll stop there. But I wanted to give you a glimpse of where we were going, and then give you an opportunity here with this PowerPoint to go ahead and break it down on a sheet of paper. If you know what I'm talking about, if you don't, I'll go over it tomorrow. But remember, chiasm is a mirror. So this concept is going to mirror this concept down here. Until you just keep working inward until you get to the axis. And the axis is the thing in the middle. And so our axis gives us a clue to the age of Moses. It tells us a story that we would know if we were Jewish about the spirit running away from the letters, or the letters running away from the Torah with that first set of tablets. And so it couldn't be written on hearts of flesh. And I think that's where some of this oblique language is coming from. My spirit shall not always strive with man forever, because he's flesh. right? Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. There was a contention there with the Israelites, and Moses even suffered because of it. And so we want to have the spirit of the words, so that it's freedom from sexual immorality, freedom from idolatry, freedom from bloodshed. And that's when you notice this, the oddity of the portion is he brings in those three cities of refuge. And that's why you have to look at them in the context of Peor: sexual immorality, idolatry, and bloodshed. Because remember, bloodshed, it starts with sexual immorality in the days of Noah, and it ends up in bloodshed. The pattern just keeps repeating itself. And so I'll take that off of there now, but that'll at least give you something between tonight and then tomorrow's lesson to work on, to work out that chiasm, and see if you can see when Moses keeps bringing up Peor, if he's not repeating the same lesson that he probably could have preached like Noah in the days of Noah. Because taking women as products is idolatry. And see, now it's expanded, but again, that's not really something new, because remember Sodom and Gomorrah? Now there's a lot of trafficking going on, and it wasn't just women. There were men and there were boys involved in that. So it's anyone who's vulnerable. But what's going to play into it as well? People who can be easily deceived. Deception plays into it. And that's in this chiasm. It's in one of the words. It's a play on word, where you realize he's saying, oh yeah, okay. It could mean a word like because, but it's depending on how you vowel it. It can also mean a sin of deception, like being deceived. And again, we know Eve was deceived going all the way back. So there is a special place, probably in hell, for people who lure and deceive others to traffic in their souls. And, probably because these two portions rest so heavily within Tisha B'Av, that's what got me to thinking, current events, anything going on Tisha B'Av? No, I don't think so. But then I'm like, oh, yeah, sex trafficking. It goes all the way back to Peor. Even a king prostituting his daughter. Seriously? A princess being prostituted for her father's purposes. And that's what they're doing. It's the person in power. They want the wealth. They want the influence. They want the territory. They want to hang around with the big names. And like Keisha was saying, if you read through some of those articles, whether it's the American newspapers or the Israeli newspapers, they'll point out how many women were involved with him. It's like madams, basically to lure the children in and do some recruiting, helping him manage this. So it's that spirit, whether you're male or female, you can have that same sick, predatory spirit. And it's almost like we can see our country right here in this Torah portion going down the tubes. And we got to stand. You know, we got to be Joshua and Caleb and say, this is not acceptable. You know, we got to be Pinchas. That is not acceptable. I don't care how much morality has replaced the commandments in textbooks and schools. I don't care how many movies they make, how many TV shows they make that say homosexuality is okay. Transgender is okay. It's not okay. It's never been okay. And it's never going to be okay. Now, we can love those people to death, and I hope we do. But you can never say it's okay. Because the moment you say it's okay, what do you think the Holy Spirit's going to do? It flies away. It goes. You can never validate it. You can love the person. That's still your loved one. That's still your coworker. That's still your friend. But that behavior will never be yours to own or validate. You know, it's so big. How do we fight it? And I'm sure Joshua and Caleb had that thought for 39 years. There's only 2 of us plus Moses.
We can't take that land without him.
Yeah. But he can restore this country. He can. We can't. But we can intercede, and he can. Because I'm going to tell you guys, if I see a puppy, or even, I don't even like cats, but if I see a cat that's abused, and I hate possums because they don't have hair on their tails, and I hate things that don't have hair on their tails, but even if I see a possum out in the road that's been hit and it's still alive, it gets to me because it's still a soul. It's a soul, and it hurts. And if there's a kinship of souls, and when other souls hurt, we should hurt. You know, and this Tisha B'Av pointed out to me, you know, you're not big on the news, but sometimes you might be missing something important that's going on right under your nose, which, you know, when I worked in the prison, it was all under my nose, but maybe that's why I'm pushing it so far away right now. I don't want to know about it anymore. I've seen the worst. I know the worst, and I don't want to know it. It's overload, but we can't stop interceding and finding ways, you know, to help people out if we can get them out. You know, Noah had an ark. There weren't many people that wanted to be saved. So there may not be a lot of people that reach out, but if there is, we need to be prepared to take them in, to do something. Oh, well, I'm still recording.